Can the Miami Heat exceed expectations for this season? What does Miami need more from Jimmy Butler, availability or aggression? We open up the mailbag to answer that and more on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome to Locked On Heat, your daily podcast on the Miami Heat, whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. I'm Wes Goldberg, editor at allyoucanheat.com, here with David Ramil. Both of us are credentialed Heat media members who cover this team every day, and the best way to support the show is to leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast app and join more than 14,000 Locked On Heat lifers by subscribing on YouTube. Today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Got a fun episode for you today. We're opening up the mailbag, doing something a little bit different today, because those of the Locked On Heat insiders, those who subscribe to the Locked On Heat Insider program, had an opportunity to submit their questions for the mailbag. So we're going to go ahead and answer all of their questions and then get to some of the questions that we got on Twitter and some other platforms here. We got a bunch of questions to get to. Jimmy Butler, does he need to be aggressive or does he need to be healthy? What can Erik Spoelstra do if Nikola Jovic doesn't work out as our starting power forward? Fair expectations of Terry Rozier. We'll get to all of that here, but let's go to this one first. It comes from Cody from our Locked On Heat Insider program on Subtext. Throughout all the talk of the starting lineup, specifically the four spot, who is the clear-cut leader for sixth man? Could this be Jaime's role, or will Alec Burks solidify that spot throughout a continued solid preseason? David, what do you think?
That's an interesting question because my feeling is that it will be Jaime because I think he's a little further ahead in that sense. But we've seen in the past Jimmy get that early hook because he wants to kind of tie those patterns together. You kind of talked about this following the first preseason game, whether or not we start to see a total line shift from one unit to the second. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to play out. We still have yet to see Tyler and what his availability is going to be like. I imagine Burks would probably come in for Tyler just because he started there, so he's probably viewed as his backup. But that cuts into Duncan Robinson's minutes too. I just don't know that Burks is going to be getting that kind of large amount of playing time. As proven a veteran as he is, and as much as his offense really showed out in that first preseason game, I don't think he's ahead of all those other guys that have been with this team for a considerable amount of time. And when you look at the sixth man specifically, I think it's going to be Jaime. I think he's going to be the first guy off the bench. I think he's going to sub in for Jimmy, and then we're going to see Jimmy's substitution pattern from last season kind of play out pretty similarly this year, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sold either that Alec Burks is going to be an every night rotation guy. I think he was starting because of Tyler Hero being out. And we've seen Erik Spoelstra do this in the past, right? Where you take a guy off the end of the bench and say, well, I want to kind of keep the integrity of my rotations here. So rather than bumping everybody up and then creating that domino effect, just take the guy who never plays, put him in the starting lineup, and then I have everything else is copacetic. I think that's kind of maybe what was going on in the preseason, although Alec Burks could certainly fight his way into some playing time, but he kind of strikes me as the guy that's like break glass in case of emergency, come in, score 18 points, call it a day. I think it's going to be Jaime Jaquez Jr. or Duncan Robinson. I think those are the two guys, right? We've seen Duncan grow as a playmaker, as a guy who could put the ball on the floor, drive. We even saw it in that preseason game, right? He had this nice like pick and roll drive from the right side over to the left side and finish on that side of the basket. Like I was like, whoa, okay, here we go. Yeah. Duncan Robinson still doing it. And I think Jaime Jaquez is obviously a guy who can create plays for himself and for others. So to me, it would be those two guys. Now, sixth man, what does that mean? Is it necessarily literally the sixth guy who plays? Is it the first guy coming off the bench? Or is it really the guy who's the anchor of that second unit, kind of getting guys in the mix? Or is it the guy who might be closing games that's not necessarily part of that starting five? I think you can argue a sixth man as any kind of, is it a Manu Ginobili type? Is it more of an Andre Iguodala type? It could be any of these kinds of players, but I think Duncan, Jaime, Haywood Highsmith, like all these guys are going to be playing major roles off the bench for the Heat. This next one comes from another one of our Locked On Heat insiders. He says, he asks, we all want Jimmy Butler to play more games, but wouldn't it be better if we just had Jimmy play more aggressively in the games that he is playing, and if he plays fewer than 65 and still get the same amount of rest and be prepared for the playoffs? David.
That's a tough question to answer. I'm not sure how you kind of separate those. Like, So let's say in this scenario, he plays what 62 games or something like that, sits out 20 games due to rest. But in those 62 games, he's what 25 point per game type Jimmy. Is that kind of how it's being envisioned here, as being laid out? Because I wasn't quite clear on how the question would play out.
I think you play. You're not pushing it to the point where Jimmy's playing a bunch of games and maybe he's worn down by the playoffs, and that kind of gets back to Pat Riley's point about availability, right? Can he play the 65 game minimum? I think the NBA, by making that the threshold to be eligible for NBA awards, has also essentially said that's the acceptable amount of games to play in an NBA season is 65. Jimmy has never played 65 games in a Miami Heat uniform in a regular season. So do you want him to push it over what he normally plays just for the sake of being out there for more games and perhaps getting the Heat a higher seed in the Eastern Conference? Or would you rather him, play what he usually does? But to me, and I always said this about Jimmy Butler, like my issue with him necessarily wasn't the fact that he only played 60 games. It's that the fact he was on the floor for 60 games. Mentally, he was engaged for maybe 20 of them. And so that's where I sort of fall on this is I don't need him to play a ton of games here.
Right.
Like he played 57 games the year that the Heat were the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. Like they don't need him to play a ton of games. He was really engaged.
Yeah.
In the second half of that year, post All-Star break, he was super engaged in that year. That's what the Heat need. So I actually agree with our Locked On Heat insider here. 65 games, about that, 60 to 65 games, that's fine for me. But in those games, like for 50 plus of those games, he has to be All-Star, All-NBA caliber. And he's basically done that every year except last year.
Yeah, I think that's where it's difficult for me because I think every time he steps on the floor, well, he might not be engaged. And we kind of talked about that in the previous episode with everything he was going through last season and everything else like that. So maybe that's a factor. I just think if we're going to expect Jimmy to play at this high level, I think he's going to be able to do it whenever he steps out on the court. And that being the case, it's kind of hard to separate if Jimmy's out there, is he going to be good? But I see your point, though. You want him to be the very, very good version of Jimmy. Not the best. We've seen that that's kind of held off for the playoffs. And for that, he does, to the question's point, he needs to be healthy. And that's the only way of doing that is if he sits out games. So I'm fine with him sitting out games as long as he's able to be great in the games that he plays in and even better during the playoffs.
We got time for one more here.
Okay.
Our next Locked On Heat insider asks, what is the go-to option for Erik Spoelstra if Nikola Jovic at the 4 position doesn't pan out? You can't realistically play Jaime and Jimmy together and keep the proper spacing. So does he go with Haywood Highsmith or maybe Nasir Little?
Yeah, I don't think Nasir, who didn't even play in the preseason game, and that might be just because he wanted to test the young guys and the guys that are probably going to be slated for the G League, etc. I don't think he's an option at the 4. I think he's a little undersized, but so is Haywood. But at least Haywood is a proven commodity who's been around the team long enough and knows what the team is trying to do. So my feeling is that would probably be Highsmith if Jovic doesn't work out at the 4. But I see no reason why he wouldn't either. Like we saw enough from him in the preseason game 1. I think he's continued to do that throughout camp. He hasn't been bad, to Erik Spoelstra's comments. He hasn't been great. Maybe he hasn't been great either.
To not have the job, whatever that double negative was that he used. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's his job to hold on to, and I think he'll continue to do so.
Yeah, I agree with you about Nico. I don't know that he's done anything to get a stranglehold on the position either. I do think Jaime Jaquez is an option. If he can improve his shooting a little bit, I think the Heat are going to answer the 3-point shooting by just saying, just put him up anyway. Like, we're going to make enough of them. Just get to 40. Just put him up. Heck, they're running. I rewatched all of Bam's 3-point shots the other day. They ran a side pick and roll with Terry Rozier and Jimmy Butler with Bam filling that strong side corner. They would have never done that. That's spacing suicide. And the Heat just said, we don't care. Just do it anyway. Bam, float out to the corner. And when you have the wide open jumper, because nobody's going to defend you, shoot it anyway. And he missed it. But it doesn't matter because he took it. And I think that might be the Heat's theory is we don't care. Just take them. Just take them. And we'll catch lightning in a bottle more often than we don't. So I think Jaime could definitely be there. And then it would be Haywood Highsmith. It can't be Nasir Little. He's a 32% 3-point shooter on low volume for his career. If you want to talk about spacing, he's the worst option out of that entire group. It's not going to be Nas Little. Coming up next, What are fair expectations for Terry Rozier next season? What do we think his stat line needs to be for the Miami Heat to be at their best? We'll talk about that next year on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Look, Game Time's got the new feature. I told you about it before. Game Time Picks. It makes getting tickets even easier when you're going to your favorite events, going to concerts, comedy shows, games, of course, wherever you're looking to get. Game Time Picks filters out all the fluff, so you will get only the incredible deals on great seats, and you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Make sure to download Game Time today, and you can see they're all in pricing feature, which gives you the total right up front, so you don't have to worry about any surprise fees at checkout. It's all in pricing. Make sure you check that out, and you get their seat views, their lowest price guarantee. So many different features at Game Time that make it the best place to buy tickets. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You get $20 off your first purchase. Terms to apply, but create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA, and you get $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's Game Time. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen of the day. We want to invite you to the exclusive Locked On Heat Insider community. If you want to join, there's a link in the show notes on YouTube and in the podcast description. Everybody who asked questions for our mailbag in the Locked On Heat Insider community is having them answered on today's show. Don't worry, we'll get to some of the Twitter questions later on, those who sent in those Twitter questions using the hashtag AskKel'el. But if you want to become a Locked On Heat lifer, well, the link, again, it's in the show notes on YouTube and in your podcast description. It's free for 14 days. After that, it's $4.99 a month, but you can cancel it at any time if you're not interested in doing it anymore. No worries, but we are really excited for this chance to connect with everybody as we get into the season here. From another Locked On Heat Insider subscriber, they ask, wouldn't it be better for Kalil Wear to start getting minutes earlier in the season rather than later finding out that Thomas Bryant isn't providing what we need in that backup big spot? David, what do you think?
You know, it feels like so many people have these unrealistic expectations for Ware. And I know you can counter that by saying, well, we don't want to limit him. We want to put him out there and see what he can do, et cetera. And I liked the impact he had in that preseason game against Charlotte. I just don't know if it's like I don't know. To me, it's better if he just kind of takes the time to develop, gets more comfortable behind the scenes, and then you can kind of look at what he does later on and put him out there with increasing playing time as the season progresses, rather than just throwing him out there. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the reality is, you know what, the reps against actual NBA competition is the best way for him to develop, and maybe that's the case. But what if he falls flat then? Like, what if that's the kind of the thing that would be the end of his career before it even really begins? And we see this all the time. Players that get put into situations where they get too much playing time because the expectations are too high and you want them to be out there. You've got to justify taking with your third pick. You get the front office who's worried about saving their jobs, etc. It's like, well, this is the guy we took. We better get him out there. It's like, well, he's not very good. Well, you put him out there and let him get better. And next thing you know, he can't find that way of adjusting. It takes him years perhaps to even find their role on this team. I don't think the Heat want to do that. I think it's slow, incremental, and growth, continuous growth. And if that's the case, then he'll wind up getting better and better as the season progresses. And I think that's in his best interest and in the team's as well.
I see both sides of this. Did you know you were talking about James Wiseman when you were doing that whole thing? Because you even said third pick. Or no, Wiseman was the second pick. But so that I saw that up close in person when I was covering the Warriors with James Wiseman. They threw him out there. He was bad, and he never got good. And his confidence was shook. It was broken. Now, injuries did not help that situation. Sure. But James Wiseman was sort of built in a way that you kind of worried about injuries. And I think Kalil Wear, without like knock on wood here, like the guy's slight. Like he's not very strong. Like he's sort of was these 7-footers. In other words, you can't ever be too careful with some of these guys. The other side of that argument too is Derek Lively. Derek Lively played 25 minutes per game in his first 20 games of his rookie season. By the playoffs, he was not a rookie anymore. That guy was seasoned and ready to go, and he played a huge role for them, for the Mavericks, getting to the finals and in the finals. So there's both sides of it, and it obviously just comes down to the individual player, how they respond to that early work, and everything like that. I also know that Derek Lively was a better prospect than Kel'el Ware coming into this draft, into their respective drafts. And that can't be overlooked. Derek Lively was viewed as more NBA ready than Kel'el Ware was. So if you want to get Kalil Wear some time early on so that he might be developed by the time the playoffs come around, and now you have that weapon, I could see that argument. I could definitely see that argument. But I just know how the Miami Heat work also. They don't give those minutes for development. They make you earn the minutes. And that's a big part, that's a cornerstone pillar of their development program is if you want to get on the court, you're going to earn it. And damn it, you're going to do everything you can do behind the scenes to earn it. Right? And that's part of their development program. So I think we sort of do get mixed up in is the guy playing or not. It's not necessarily like that in the NBA. You can do a lot of development behind the scenes. You can go to the G League and all these things. And it's not the demotion it used to be, right? It's just for playing time. It's for development purposes. I think the Heat have a pretty good grasp on player development, I would argue. And so at this point, I just defer to the Heat. Whatever they think is the right way to go with the Kel'el Wear, they have earned my trust on that.
And I've got two words why Derek Lively played as much last year, and it's Dwight Powell. Like,
right.
It's not Bam Adebayo.
Have Bam in front of you. And by the way, I'm not here just assuming that Thomas Bryant is getting all these minutes either. Like Kevin Love re-signed with the Heat with the understanding that he's gonna play. He didn't re-sign with the Heat thinking that I'm gonna be Udonis Haslem. He's not there yet. He's fully aware that he'll get there someday. And that's what he hopes. He's hoping that he's playing until he's 40 years old. That's his goal. But he doesn't think he's there yet. And I'm not sure he's there yet either, even though we have seen some decline on that end. I think it's going to go the other way. I actually think Kevin Love is going to be the primary backup behind Bam. They'll use Thomas Bryant when they need to. Matchups, whatever, injuries, whatever it might be. And then by the end of the year, Kel'el Wear will have developed enough behind the scenes that he might actually emerge as Bam's primary backup by April. And I think that's at least the hope in Miami.
Yes.
And then at that point, it doesn't matter where Kel'el Wear or it doesn't matter where Kevin Love or Thomas Bryant are on the depth chart because they'll be behind Kel'el Wear. So I do think I think the plan is actually the flip side of that. Our next question, another Lockdown Heat insider here. What is the scoring average expectation of Terry Rozier? Do we want 14 points per game but average 8 assists, or do we want 21 points per game and 4 assists? Do we want a true point guard, or does going to a 5-out style offense mean everybody drives and kicks, and we could see a world where we have 4 players average over 20 points per game? David, what do you think?
My tendency is to think that it would be lower on the scoring end and higher on the assists. I don't think it just between him and Tyler, you're going to have to find this balance where both of them are going to have opportunities to make plays for others. Both of them are going to have opportunities to score. So rather than 14 and 8, I would say maybe 18 and 6. And then Tyler maybe a little bit higher than that in the scoring end. I would say 20 and 6. I don't know how realistic that is, but I think that's the best plan for Miami is to have them be both, to kind of share that responsibility, because I think you have a lot of different options on this team, especially if Bam is going to be being able to space the floor more regularly. Both of those guys are going to have the opportunity to attack the paint and spray it out to a wide open shooter, and we'll see how that goes in terms of boosting their assist numbers. But hopefully they'll also get better opportunities to score. And we know that Rozier isn't shy about scoring, neither is Tyler. Just want to see them be a little bit more effective and efficient throughout the course of the season.
Based on what we've seen and heard, media day, training camp, and in that first preseason game scrimmage, still haven't seen Tyler Hero play, obviously, but Tyler Hero is going to be off the ball more. And I think that based on what we've heard and based on what I've seen, Terry Rozier is going to be on the ball more, right? Terry Rozier was the primary initiator in that offense when those guys were all on the court. The initial trigger of the drive and kick offense. Now, it's a 5-out offense. Everybody is going to drive and kick to the point of the question, but who does it first is a fair question. And who does it first has a greater chance of just racking up more assists. I think that first player will be, more times than not, Terry Rozier. It'll be Jimmy Butler sometimes. Sometimes it'll be Ware. Sometimes it'll be Nico. Sometimes it'll be Tyler. But more often than not, I think it's going to be Terry Rozier. I think for Terry Rozier, the averages that I would want him to have that would equate to, in my opinion, the best success for the team, 15 points per game on 38% shooting from three-point range, 5 or 6 assists, and just awesome defense. Like, get back to that level of defense that he showed earlier in his career. He had a nice block against Charlotte in that preseason game, fighting over screens, all of that stuff. That's what I want from him. I want a greater percentage of his three-pointer shots to be assisted instead of unassisted, instead of the step backs and the pull-ups and all that stuff. If Tyler or Jimmy or whoever is setting him up for those things, Bam Adebayo on the dribble handoffs, like all that stuff can work in Terry Rozier's favor in terms of boosting that efficiency, which is the biggest problem with his game. I want the volume to come down. I want the efficiency to go up. 15 points per game, 6 assists per game. And then with Tyler Hero, I'd actually argue I don't want 6 assists per game. That would be a career high for him. He was at like 4.5 last year. I want him to cut that in half. I want Tyler Hero at like 25 points per game, 24 points per game because he's shooting way more threes and like 2.5 assists per game. Like I don't need him assisting. I want him being the receiver of those assists. Like that's the best usage of Tyler Hero. What's Thomas Bryant's role this season, and is he really in front of Kel'el Ware on the depth chart? Plus, do we think that the Heat could outperform expectations and be a top 4 seed in the East this season? All of that next year as we continue our mailbag on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return over at FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. Sometimes you just get a hunch in the middle of a game you're watching and you want to check out the latest stats. You want to view live play-by-play. And guess what? You can do that and so much more all on the same page where you place your bets, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. And all you've got to do is place your first $5 bet. You place a $5 bet and you're guaranteed to start with $200 in bonus bets, but only when you go visit FanDuel.com to get started. So go to FanDuel.com today. We'll be right back.
Thanks again for making Locked On Heat your first listen of the day. The best way to support the show, leave a 5-star rating review on your podcast app. Hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Let's now transition to our questions on Twitter. Thanks to everybody who sent in mailbag questions on Twitter using the hashtag AskLOHeat. As always, we will be taking those questions at any time. We love answering these questions at the end of our recaps. We use Twitter primarily for that. Again, the hashtag is AskLOHeat. This one comes from our friend Shaish, who writes in.
Ooh.
Are you guys buying into the Heat outperforming expectations this year and being a top 4 seed or better? Top 4 seed or better? Top 4 seed, right? You can't be better than a top 4 seed.
4 or better in the Eastern Conference, I guess.
Right.
Shaish, I mean, we love you, Shaish. You know, he's been at every one of our watch parties. Big fan. Loves the show.
Big time mailbag contributor.
Yes,
putting
definitely.
in the reps there.
I think you can have it both ways. I think they're gonna overachieve expectations because the expectations are so low. Like we just went over the GM survey in the previous episode. We went through our top 7. Miami might wind up as the 7th seed, which isn't nearly great. It's not nearly good enough. But I don't know that they can necessarily get into a top 4 seed in the Eastern Conference. I think they can certainly win more games than even we might expect them to, and still wind up having a really good season and a deep playoff run, etc. But I just don't see them being able to knock off those powerhouse teams at the top of the Eastern Conference. No matter how deep this team is and how juiced up the offense might be over the course of the season, it's again, talent has found a way, and injury has always been something that dogs this group so consistently that I'm not prepared to just say they're not going to be injured. They're going to be able to, somehow wind up as the 4th seed or the 3rd seed in the Eastern Conference and overlook what Philadelphia has done, what New York has done, what Milwaukee has done, etc.
So most people going into the season, myself included, have a pretty clear top 4 in the Eastern Conference: Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Milwaukee, in whatever order. Boston usually number 1. And then you've got that middle group, and I read a lot, I listen to a lot of national stuff. It's Cleveland, it's Orlando, it's Indiana, and not a lot of people are talking about Miami in that group. And you look at the FanDuel over-unders, Miami's win total over-under is at 44.5. Indiana's at 47.5. Orlando's 47.5. Cleveland's 48.5. I mean, the public views those 3 teams as better than the Miami Heat. So when we're talking about outperforming expectations, we're not talking about climbing up into that 4 mix with Philly, New York, Milwaukee. Outperforming expectations is getting into that tier with Indiana, Orlando, Cleveland. Like, this is what, when you talk about the expectations being so low, you're at 100% on. These are the Heat are like between that Indiana, Cleveland, Orlando tier and like wherever the Atlanta Hawks and the Charlotte Hornets are. Like that, by these win total over-unders, that's where the Heat are perceived to be, in sort of a tier by themselves. I do think then, in that, if we're using that definition of expectations, I think they'll outperform expectations. I think maybe this is just my blind optimism. I think they're going to be one of the top 6 teams. I think they'll avoid the play-in tournament. I think they'll be one of the top 6 teams in the East. The other thing I know is this. Those 4 teams that we were talking about, the top 4, one of them is not going to finish in the top 4. One of them is going to slip out. It happens every year in both conferences. One of them will slip out. There'll be some injury or something will happen or something that we think is going to go right doesn't go quite right. The cat trade doesn't go right, or maybe the Bucks implode, or whatever it might be. Philadelphia, another Embiid injury, something happens, and one of these teams slip out. That's going to make room for one of these other teams to climb into that top 4. It could be Miami, it could be Orlando, it could be Indiana, it could be Cleveland. It's going to be one of those teams. One of those teams is going to finish in the top 4. I'm not in the mood of trying to place a bet right now, but yeah, I think they'll outperform those expectations. Top 4 might be a little high. Malachi writes in,
Ooh.
Is Thomas Bryant playing his way into a role for the Heat, or does preseason not matter for guys like him, whether he continues to play well or not?
I think it matters. I don't think it matters to the same degree as it does for some younger players or guys that are on the end of the roster. Like, I think they've seen enough of what TB can do last year, what he did over summer. Like, he put in the work during training camp and the weeks before. Like, he was a fixture at the Kaseya Center. You know, we saw a lot of footage of him kind of working out leading up to the season. So I think the expectation is that he'll have some role. I don't know how to figure it out right now, because there were some good plays from him, and then there were some Thomas Bryant-like plays where he just, didn't shoot the ball well, or was kind of out of place on defense. It didn't really look like he could do much of anything. And, I think there's just limitations on who he is as a player. I don't know that he's going to get that kind of spot. Again, to your point, I think he probably is the third string center at this point. Is he any better than Kevin Love? I don't think so. Think so. I trust Kevin's 3-point shooting, even though we haven't seen it really. But I think, I think his 3-point shooting is going to be the one thing that gets him more playing time, whether it's at the 4 or the 5 spot or whatever.
Well, and his chemistry with Jimmy Butler, specifically when he's the backup 5. I mean, that is tried and true.
Yeah, you're right.
The Heat re-signed Thomas Bryant for a reason. I'm not really sure what the reason was, but they wouldn't have re-signed him if they didn't think the guy could play. They think the guy could play. They basically took the 3-point shot away from him last year just because of the way the offense worked. That's not the case this year. He took 4 3-pointers in that preseason game against Charlotte. Kevin Love did make a 3-pointer against Charlotte. Like, centers are going to take threes now. I think the new offense actually works in Thomas Bryant's favor. That said, they're not going to force him onto the court if they don't have to. I think he is more of he's your third backup center. He probably doesn't play most nights. He'll play some nights. Foul trouble, injuries, matchups, what have you. In terms of whether or not, I think the preseason matters for a guy like him a little bit. I don't think it matters as much to him as it does for a lot of other players on this roster. But yeah, I think the Heat envisions some kind of role for him. And I don't think it's an every night role, but he'll play sometimes. Last one here. Jay the Fox 101 writes in, are you concerned about Kalil Ware's motor?
Ooh. Motor, that's a tough one. I think you pointed it out in the preseason recap. You had concerns about his endurance, even leading up to the draft. We haven't really seen him play a lot. He's a 7-foot body. It's kind of hard to lug that body around. It's going to tire you out on occasion. I don't know if it's necessarily motor or just the fact that he's a huge human being that can't move around so nimbly as others can. And that I think there is a lack of spatial awareness at times. And I kind of pointed this out, like he does not always have the highest basketball IQ. Those things can be learned, and I think he can figure it out. Does he have the feel for the game that kind of maximizes that length and size overall? I don't know. That's going to be something that we're going to have to monitor and develop it. I don't think there's any problems with his motor necessarily, but I do think those other things are kind of factors that contribute to what we all interpret as maybe a low motor or something like that. He's not Pelle Larsson. He's not diving all over the floor. He's not Keshad Johnson, who we saw dive specifically on the floor to try and force a turnover, et cetera. Like, those guys are different. They're built differently physically, and so they can't afford to go and just dive around. Kalil Wear goes down like that. He might stay down.
He might not ever get up, right?
Yeah. So
no, I think when I'm watching that preseason game, and I understand where this question is coming from, he was moving around really slowly. He wasn't boxing out. He wasn't crashing the boards for rebounds that were kind of right in front of him. And so I understand, and I understand the questions about the motor, because also that was a question going into the draft was people were questioning his motor. Now, everybody on the Miami Heat and in that organization will tell you publicly and privately, we're not worried about the motor. And I don't think it's lip service, because if they were worried about the motor, then they wouldn't have drafted him, right? Like, this isn't like an apology you make up later. Like, they wouldn't have picked him if they were worried. Any team in the league, they're not picking, like the Heat aren't picking a player that they're worried about their motor necessarily. His conditioning isn't where it needs to be, and that's okay. That to me, and so it's kind of like what you were saying too. Like, when he's not boxing out, trying to go all like full tilt for those rebounds, whatever it is, it's not because it's a lack of want-to. It's not a lack of motor. It's a lack of conditioning. He's tired. It takes a lot of gasoline to move a 7-foot body around, just like it takes a lot of it makes more gasoline to fill up your F-150 than it does the Prius, right? It just takes more gasoline to move the 7-foot body around. And by the end of that Charlotte game, he was gassed. And I like, you could say, like, he only played like 15 minutes. He shouldn't be gassed. You're right. He shouldn't be gassed. That's why he's part of the Miami Heat now. It's because that conditioning is going to get better, but it's just not where it needs to be yet. And that's part of his development, you know? And I think the Heat know that, and I think they understand that, and that's why everybody, even after training camp, was saying, yeah, he's really good, super skilled, all these things. He'll be ready eventually.
Yeah.
There's nobody in the organization telling you that Kel'el Ware is ready right now. There is not a person telling you that he's ready right now, and that's, I think, one of the biggest reasons, plus all the things you talked about in terms of basketball IQ, feel for the game, understanding where he needs to be on the NBA court. But he'll get minutes. He'll get minutes.
And I talked about it after the preseason game. You know, he's used to being able to just easily pull down these boards over other players. He's never had to have that kind of motor. When you're 7 feet tall, it's kind of just easy to block shots. You don't have to
really he didn't have to be that conditioned. He didn't have to be that strong. He was just like doing whatever he wanted to do, and now he has to be.
Right. Exactly.
That'll do it for us today. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on your favorite podcast app.